The fastest way to reveal someone's true character is not to hand them power, but to let them believe another person has none. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across the grand ballroom of the Sterling Grand Hotel as a string quartet filled the air with gentle music, and elegantly dressed guests gathered to celebrate one of the city's most anticipated engagement parties. Every polished glass reflected wealth. Every carefully arranged flower hinted at perfection. Servers moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays, while conversations drifted through the room like quiet laughter. Among them was Emily Brooks, a 30-year-old waitress whose calm smile never disappeared no matter how busy the evening became. Tucked safely inside the small pocket of her neatly pressed apron rested a worn family photograph. Before every shift, she touched its folded edge for just a moment, as though borrowing strength from the faces printed on its fading paper. The picture showed Emily sitting beside her late husband, Daniel, while their little son Ethan smiled between them with innocent joy. It was the only photograph they had ever taken together as a complete family, and Emily carried it everywhere because it reminded her that love could survive even when life changed forever. Across the ballroom, billionaire William Sterling greeted business leaders, longtime friends, and charitable partners with genuine warmth. Although the celebration honored his engagement, he seemed more interested in making every guest feel welcome than admiring the luxury surrounding him. Standing beside him was Victoria Sinclair, his elegant fiancée. Her designer gown shimmered beneath the lights, and every movement reflected effortless confidence. She believed appearances revealed everything worth knowing about a person. As the evening continued, Emily quietly cleared finished dinner plates from a nearby table. When she bent slightly to lift a serving tray, the old photograph slipped unnoticed from her apron pocket and landed softly beside a chair. Victoria happened to see it before anyone else. She frowned as she picked up the worn picture between two fingers, studying its faded corners with obvious disapproval. "Why would anyone carry something this old to a formal event?" she murmured. Without waiting for an answer or searching for its owner, she walked toward a nearby waste basket reserved for discarded napkins and wrapping paper. With a careless flick of her wrist, she dropped the family photograph inside. Emily turned only a second too late. Her eyes widened as she realized what had happened. She hurried forward, stopping just short of the wastebasket, her voice gentle rather than angry. "Excuse me, ma'am. That photograph belongs to me." Victoria looked at her with polite indifference. "It is only an old picture. Surely it cannot be that important." Emily's lips parted, but no words came. Some memories could never be explained to people who measured value by appearance. Just as she knelt to retrieve the photograph, an elderly gentleman seated at the neighboring table slowly rose to his feet. Harold Bennett had remained quietly observing the evening until that very moment. His trembling hands reached toward the photograph before Emily could pick it up. He stared at the image with growing disbelief. His breathing became uneven as his eyes fixed on the smiling little boy standing between his parents. The entire ballroom seemed to fade around him. Guests continued talking. Glasses gently clinked together. Music floated through the air. Yet Harold heard none of it. His fingers trembled against the faded paper as tears quietly filled his eyes. In a voice barely above a whisper, he looked directly at Ethan, who had been patiently waiting near the service entrance for his mother to finish her shift, and said, "I have been searching for this child for 8 years." Emily carefully lifted the worn photograph from the wastebasket before gently brushing away a few tiny pieces of paper that had settled against its faded edges. She handled it as though it were made of glass rather than ordinary paper, her fingertips lingering for just a moment over Daniel's familiar smile before quietly slipping it back into her hands. Harold Bennett remained standing beside her, unable to look away from the image. His eyes moved from the photograph to the young boy waiting patiently near the service entrance, then back again, as though his heart refused to believe what his eyes had already accepted. The ballroom continued celebrating around them. Waiters refilled crystal glasses. Soft music drifted through the elegant room. Guests laughed beneath sparkling chandeliers. Yet inside the small circle surrounding Emily, time seemed to move differently. William Sterling noticed the unusual silence spreading across several nearby tables. Excusing himself from a conversation with investors, he walked toward the gathering with calm curiosity. "Is everything all right?" he asked politely. Emily immediately lowered her eyes. "Everything is fine, sir," she answered with the quiet professionalism she carried into every shift. Before anyone else could speak, Harold slowly stepped forward. "Young man," he said while looking at William, "there are moments when a celebration becomes less important than the truth." William studied the elderly gentleman with respectful attention. Harold had been one of his late father's closest friends and one of the most respected guests in the room. If Harold spoke with such seriousness, William knew there had to be a reason. Victoria crossed her arms gently, still unconvinced. "It was only an old photograph," she said. "I simply thought it belonged with the trash." Emily never argued. She only folded the picture carefully and held it close to her heart. Harold turned toward Victoria, his expression filled not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. "There are photographs worth millions because collectors admire them," he said softly. "Then there are photographs worth everything because they are the last place someone still lives." The words settled over the nearby guests like complete silence. Victoria looked away for the first time that evening. William glanced at Emily with genuine concern. "I am sorry if anyone caused you pain during our celebration," he said sincerely. Emily offered a small smile. "Thank you, sir. Sometimes people simply do not know what something means to someone else." Harold slowly approached Ethan, who had remained remarkably calm despite the attention surrounding him. The boy looked up with polite curiosity. Around his neck rested a small silver pendant that had slipped out from beneath his sweater while he waited for his mother. Harold's breathing caught once again. The pendant matched the one he had seen decades earlier around Daniel Brooks's neck almost every single day. It was handmade, simple, and impossible to mistake. Harold knelt carefully until he was eye level with Ethan. "May I ask you something?" he whispered. Ethan nodded. "Who gave you that necklace?" The boy smiled without hesitation. "My dad did. Mom says he wanted me to wear it when I was old enough to understand that family is something you carry with you every day." Harold slowly closed his eyes as tears gathered along the edges of his weathered face. He recognized not only the pendant, but the exact words Daniel had once spoken to him during a quiet afternoon many years before. Opening his eyes again, he looked toward Emily with overwhelming certainty. "Your husband kept his promise," he said gently. "Now it is finally time for me to keep mine." Harold remained kneeling before Ethan for another quiet moment, studying the little boy with an expression that carried equal parts wonder and regret. The silver pendant resting against Ethan's sweater reflected the warm ballroom lights, but it was not the jewelry itself that held Harold's attention. It was the memory attached to it. Decades earlier, he had watched Daniel Brooks wear that same pendant through seasons of hardship and moments of quiet triumph, always insisting that family was life's greatest inheritance. Harold slowly rose to his feet and turned toward William Sterling. "There is something you deserve to hear," he said gently. William nodded without hesitation. The music continued playing softly in the background, but nearby conversations gradually faded as more guests sensed that something meaningful was unfolding. Emily remained silent, holding the recovered photograph carefully between both hands. She had spent years protecting the few memories she still possessed of Daniel, never imagining that one forgotten evening at work would suddenly bring strangers who remembered him so vividly. William motioned toward a quieter sitting area beside the ballroom's tall windows overlooking the city lights. "Please," he said respectfully, "let us sit down." Harold accepted with a grateful nod. Emily hesitated for only a moment before joining them, while Ethan quietly took the seat beside his mother. Victoria followed several steps behind, her confident expression slowly giving way to uncertainty. She had expected the evening to revolve around elegant speeches and expensive champagne. Instead, an old family photograph had become the center of everyone's attention. Harold folded his hands together before speaking. "Many years ago, Daniel Brooks saved my family's future without ever asking for recognition." Emily looked up in surprise. She had heard countless stories about Daniel's kindness, yet this was one she had never known. Harold smiled faintly, as though watching memories return one by one. "I owned a small manufacturing company that struggled through a difficult financial season. Most people walked away because they believed failure was inevitable. Daniel stayed. He worked extra hours, solved problems no one else wanted to solve, and reminded every exhausted employee that character mattered most when circumstances became difficult." William listened carefully. He had built his own business through determination, but he recognized something different in Harold's voice. He was not describing talent or intelligence. He was describing integrity. Harold continued quietly. The company survived because one ordinary man refused to stop believing in people. After everything stabilized, I offered Daniel a generous reward. He smiled and declined every dollar. Ethan looked toward his mother with growing curiosity. Emily smiled softly. That sounds exactly like your father. Harold nodded. Instead of accepting money, he asked me for one promise. The room grew completely still. He said, "If life ever separates my family from yours, promise me that if you find them before I do, you will remind them that they were always loved." Harold lowered his eyes as emotion briefly overcame his voice. I promised him. Emily felt her heart tighten. Daniel had never mentioned such a conversation because he had never expected that promise would someday become necessary. Harold looked directly at her. When I learned he had passed away, I searched everywhere. Your old apartment had already been emptied. Friends had lost contact. Every trail disappeared. Emily quietly answered. I moved to another city after everything changed. I needed work, and I wanted Ethan to have a fresh beginning. Harold nodded with understanding. Then life finally brought us together tonight. Not because of wealth or coincidence, but because one worn photograph refused to let a promise disappear forever. Emily lowered her eyes toward the family photograph resting gently in her hands. For years, she had believed the memories inside that faded picture belonged only to her and Ethan. She had never imagined that someone sitting among the distinguished guests would recognize not only Daniel's face, but also the promise he had quietly carried through his life. The elegant ballroom no longer felt intimidating. It felt strangely still, as though every glittering light above them had paused to listen. William leaned forward, his expression thoughtful rather than impatient. "Mr. Bennett," he said softly, "if Daniel meant that much to you, I would like to understand who he truly was." Harold smiled with quiet gratitude. "Most people would begin by telling you what he accomplished," he replied. "I would rather tell you how he treated people when no one was watching." Emily listened carefully. Every new story felt like opening another page of a book she thought had already ended. Harold rested both hands on his cane before continuing. Daniel believed that every person deserved the same respect, whether they owned the company or swept the floors after closing time. I watched him learn the names of every maintenance worker. I watched him stay late simply because someone else needed help finishing a difficult shift. He never asked whether kindness would benefit him. He simply believed it was the right thing to do. William quietly nodded. Those words reminded him of the values his own father had tried to teach before success became measured by numbers instead of character. Victoria remained unusually silent. She watched Emily carefully folding the photograph back into its protective sleeve, noticing for the first time how gently she handled something that carried no financial value, yet clearly meant more than any expensive object displayed throughout the ballroom. Harold reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and carefully removed a small leather notebook whose corners had softened with age. He opened it slowly until he found a page marked by a faded ribbon. "Daniel gave this to me the last time we met," he said. "Whenever I doubted people, he reminded me to read these words." Harold handed the notebook to William. Written neatly across the page were only two short sentences. "Real wealth is measured by the lives that become lighter because you were present. Titles disappear. Character remains." William read the words twice before quietly closing the notebook. He did not immediately return it. Instead, he looked across the ballroom where dozens of employees continued serving guests with quiet professionalism. For the first time that evening, he noticed not uniforms or job titles, but people. Emily gently placed one hand on Ethan's shoulder. The little boy had been listening without interrupting, his bright eyes moving between each speaker with patient curiosity. "Mom," he whispered softly, "Dad really knew all these people?" Emily smiled warmly. "Your father believed every friendship was worth keeping, even if years passed without seeing each other." Harold looked at Ethan with unmistakable affection. "That is exactly why I never stopped searching. I was not looking for an heir or a family obligation. I was looking for the people Daniel trusted me to remember." William slowly stood from his chair and looked toward Emily with quiet sincerity. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not only because something precious to you was treated carelessly tonight, but because I allowed a celebration of success to become more important than the people serving it. That changes now. As his words settled over the nearby tables, several guests who had quietly followed the conversation lowered their eyes in thoughtful silence, realizing that the most meaningful moment of the evening had nothing to do with luxury, but everything to do with the forgotten value of honoring another person's memories. The ballroom remained filled with elegant conversation, yet the atmosphere around Emily, Ethan, William, Harold, and Victoria had changed completely. It was no longer the setting that held everyone's attention. It was the quiet realization that one ordinary family photograph had revealed more truth than the evening's polished speeches ever could. Harold slowly opened the leather notebook again, turning several pages before stopping at another carefully preserved note folded between them. Its paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. "Daniel asked me to keep this if we were ever separated," Harold said softly. "I never imagined the day would come when I could finally share it." Emily looked at the folded note with surprise. She had never seen it before. Harold carefully unfolded the paper and began reading. "Harold, if you ever meet my family without me beside them, do not tell them what I achieved. Tell them I tried to leave every room kinder than I found it. If my son is old enough to understand, remind him that respect should never depend on another person's title." Ethan listened with complete attention, as though every sentence allowed him to know his father a little more. William quietly lowered his head. Those simple words carried more weight than any business advice he had ever received. Harold continued reading. "If life gives my family difficult days, remind them that difficult days are not permanent. Character is. Tell Emily that every ordinary morning we shared was already a beautiful life." Emily closed her eyes as tears quietly rolled down her cheeks. For years she had worried that Ethan would grow up with only fading memories and unanswered questions. Instead, every story Harold shared painted another vivid picture of the man she had loved. Victoria remained completely silent. She watched Emily protect the worn photograph and listened to Daniel's words with growing regret. For the first time that evening, she understood that what she had dismissed as an old piece of paper had actually been the last physical reminder of an entire chapter of someone's life. She slowly stepped toward Emily. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "I judged something I never tried to understand." Emily looked at her for a long moment before offering a gentle smile. "Sometimes we all make decisions before knowing the whole story." There was no bitterness in her voice, only grace. Victoria lowered her eyes. "Thank you for giving me more kindness than I gave you." Harold smiled softly as he watched the exchange. Daniel had often said that forgiveness revealed strength more clearly than revenge ever could. William carefully returned the notebook to Harold before addressing everyone gathered nearby. "My father used to tell me that success should make us more humble, not more distant," he said. "Tonight, I almost forgot that lesson. I will not forget it again." Several guests standing within earshot quietly nodded. Some restaurant employees paused only briefly before returning to their duties, but many carried thoughtful expressions as they resumed serving the evening's dinner. Ethan reached into his pocket and gently removed the small silver pendant hanging from his neck. He looked at Harold with innocent curiosity. "Do you think Dad would be happy today?" Harold smiled through moist eyes and placed a gentle hand over the little boy's shoulder. "I believe he would be proud for only one reason," he answered. "The people he loved are still choosing kindness, even after life gave them every reason to choose something else." As those words settled over the quiet circle, the grand ballroom no longer felt like a place built for wealth and celebration. It had quietly become a place where an old promise, carried faithfully through the years, had finally begun finding its way home. The evening slowly settled into a quieter rhythm, but no one seated near Emily's table seemed interested in returning to ordinary conversation. The elegant celebration had transformed into something far more meaningful than anyone had expected. Harold carefully placed Daniel's handwritten note back inside the leather notebook before looking toward Ethan with a gentle smile that carried years of unanswered hope. "There is one more thing your father trusted me to protect," he said softly. Emily looked at him with quiet surprise. She had already received more pieces of Daniel's life in a single evening than she had imagined still existed. Harold reached into the inner pocket of his jacket once again and removed a small velvet pouch that had clearly been carried for many years. He opened it carefully, revealing a simple brass key attached to a worn leather tag. The tag bore only 2 words written in Daniel's familiar handwriting. "Keep going." Ethan leaned closer with curious eyes. "What does it open?" he asked. Harold smiled gently. "A small safety deposit box your father rented years ago. He told me that if life ever became complicated, I should hold on to this key until I found his family again." Emily looked at the tiny key resting in Harold's weathered palm, struggling to understand why Daniel had never mentioned it. Harold seemed to read her thoughts. "He never expected you would need it," he explained quietly. "He believed he would someday hand it to you himself. Life simply wrote a different ending than the one he imagined." William listened in thoughtful silence. The wealth surrounding the ballroom suddenly seemed insignificant compared with the quiet trust contained inside one small brass key. Victoria also watched without speaking. Earlier that evening, she had judged an old photograph because it looked worn. Now she realized that the most valuable things often appeared ordinary until someone understood their story. Harold continued gently. "I never opened the box. Daniel made me promise that whatever was inside belonged only to his family." Emily took a slow breath before carefully accepting the key with both hands. It felt surprisingly light, yet it carried the weight of years she could never recover. Ethan smiled at his mother. "Dad still had surprises for us." Emily laughed softly through grateful tears. "Apparently he did." Harold looked toward William. "Your father knew Daniel as well." They admired each other because neither believed success should ever replace kindness. William nodded slowly. "My father often told me that the strongest people are usually the quietest ones in the room." I understand now where that lesson came from. Around them, several guests had quietly returned to their conversations, but many continued glancing toward Emily with new respect. They no longer saw only a waitress serving dinner. They saw a woman who had quietly protected love, memory, and dignity through years of ordinary sacrifice. William rose from his chair and addressed the restaurant manager standing nearby. "Beginning tomorrow," he said calmly, "every employee appreciation program at this hotel will include every member of the staff, from executives to dishwashers. Respect should never depend on a job title." The manager smiled with immediate agreement. Emily looked at William with genuine appreciation. "Thank you," she said softly. William shook his head. "Do not thank me. Tonight your family reminded me of something I should never have forgotten." Harold watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Daniel had once believed that the smallest acts of goodness could continue changing lives long after the person who began them was gone. Sitting beneath the warm ballroom lights, surrounded by people whose hearts had been quietly changed, Harold realized that Daniel had been right all along. Some promises did not end when they were spoken. They simply waited patiently until the right moment to become someone else's future. Emily carefully closed her fingers around the small brass key, feeling its smooth edges rest against her palm, while Ethan looked at it with quiet fascination. It was remarkable how something so ordinary could suddenly connect the present to a promise made many years earlier. Harold smiled as he watched them. "Your father always believed that hope should have a place to wait," he said softly. That key was his way of making sure tomorrow would always have something left to discover. Emily slipped the key into the same protective sleeve that held the family photograph, determined that the 2 reminders of Daniel would never again be separated. Around the ballroom, the atmosphere had grown noticeably gentler. Guests who had arrived expecting an evening of elegant celebration now found themselves speaking more quietly, smiling more sincerely, and looking differently at the employees serving dinner around them. William noticed the subtle change with quiet gratitude. He had hosted many successful events throughout his career, but none had ever transformed people's hearts quite like this unexpected conversation. He slowly walked toward the small stage where the engagement toast had been scheduled to take place. A member of the hotel staff handed him the microphone, expecting a traditional speech filled with gratitude and celebration. William stood silently for a few moments, looking across the room before speaking. "This evening began as a celebration of 2 people," he said calmly. "But I believe it has become a reminder of something far more important." Every conversation in the ballroom faded into silence. William continued. "Earlier tonight, an old family photograph was mistaken for something disposable. What happened afterward reminded me that the most valuable things in life rarely appear valuable at first glance. Sometimes they arrive folded inside an apron pocket instead of displayed inside a glass case. Several guests instinctively looked toward Emily, who immediately lowered her eyes with humble embarrassment. William smiled warmly in her direction before continuing. We often admire success because it shines brightly. Yet character usually works quietly where very few people are paying attention. Tonight, I met a family whose quiet strength deserves far more recognition than any accomplishment I could celebrate from this stage. A gentle wave of applause spread across the ballroom. Emily looked at Ethan, who squeezed her hand with a proud smile. Harold remained seated, his eyes reflecting both gratitude and relief. The promise he had carried for so many years no longer belonged only to him. It had finally reached the people it was always meant to find. William then turned toward the hotel's executive management team gathered near the stage. Beginning tonight, he announced, every annual employee appreciation banquet hosted by Sterling Hospitality will reserve the front tables for the people who welcome guests, prepare meals, clean rooms, wash dishes, and quietly serve others every single day. Leadership begins by recognizing those whose work is often overlooked. The announcement was met with warm applause from both employees and guests alike. Victoria stood quietly beside the stage listening to every word. She understood that no public apology could erase what had happened earlier, but she also realized that genuine growth began when pride finally stepped aside. She slowly approached Emily once again. "Would you allow me to do something?" she asked gently. Emily looked at her with calm curiosity. Victoria reached into her evening clutch and carefully removed a small silver picture frame decorated with simple engraved vines. She placed it into Emily's hands. "Your photograph deserves protection," she said softly. "Not because it became important tonight, but because it always was." Emily smiled with quiet gratitude. She accepted the frame, not as a gift of wealth, but as a symbol that understanding had finally replaced judgment. And somewhere beyond the sparkling lights of the ballroom, Daniel's unseen legacy continued changing lives exactly as he always believed it would. As the applause gradually faded, the ballroom settled into a peaceful quiet unlike anything it had known earlier that evening. The music resumed softly, but now every note seemed gentler, as though the room itself had been transformed by the stories it had witnessed. Emily carefully placed the silver picture frame beside the family photograph before slipping both into her handbag together with the small brass key. For the first time in years, the precious reminders of Daniel no longer felt like fragile pieces of the past. They felt like the beginning of something new. Harold slowly stood and looked toward William. "There is one final promise I must fulfill," he said. William nodded with quiet respect. "Whatever you need, I am here." Harold smiled warmly before turning to Emily and Ethan. "Tomorrow morning, I would like to accompany both of you to the bank, where Daniel kept the safety deposit box. I believe whatever he left behind belongs in your hands, not mine." Emily looked down at the brass key resting safely inside her handbag. She had spent so many years learning to expect very little from life that hope itself felt unfamiliar. "Thank you," she whispered, "not only for keeping your promise, but for remembering him all these years." Harold gently shook his head. "Some people leave behind buildings. Some leave behind fortunes. Daniel left behind better people. That is the rarest legacy of all." Ethan smiled brightly. "Dad still helps people even now." Harold's eyes filled with quiet emotion. "Yes, he does." William glanced around the ballroom before making one final request to the hotel staff. Within a few minutes, an easel was brought into the center of the room together with a simple cream-colored mat. William carefully asked Emily for permission to temporarily display the family photograph. She hesitated only briefly before agreeing. A hotel conservator gently placed the worn picture inside a protective display sleeve so every guest could see it without risking damage. There was no spotlight, no dramatic announcement. Guests simply walked by one after another, quietly looking at the faded image of an ordinary family whose love had outlasted time. Many paused longer than they expected. Some smiled softly. Others wiped away quiet tears before returning to their tables. Victoria stood near the display for several minutes without speaking. Finally, she looked toward Emily. "I spent years believing beautiful things had to look perfect," she admitted. "Tonight, I learned that the most beautiful things often carry the deepest scars." Emily answered with the same calm grace she had shown throughout the evening. Sometimes what survives becomes more beautiful because it survived. William heard the exchange and smiled quietly. He realized that no expensive decoration in the ballroom had drawn as much attention as one worn photograph folded inside a waitress's apron only an hour earlier. Near the end of the evening, the hotel photographer approached William, asking whether he would like another formal engagement portrait before guests departed. William looked toward Emily, Ethan, and Harold standing together beneath the warm lights. Then he smiled politely and shook his head. "Not tonight," he replied. "Tonight, the most important picture has already been taken years ago." The photographer followed William's gaze toward the faded family photograph displayed at the center of the ballroom and lowered his camera without another word. In that quiet moment, everyone seemed to understand that some images never lose their meaning because they were never created to impress the world. They were created to remind the people inside them that love, once given freely, continues finding its way home long after the moment itself has passed. The last guest slowly drifted toward the grand ballroom doors as the evening came to a gentle close. The chandeliers still shimmered above polished marble floors, but the room no longer felt defined by elegance or celebration. It felt defined by quiet understanding. Emily stood near the entrance with Ethan beside her, her handbag resting lightly against her shoulder. Inside it were the family photograph, the silver picture frame, and the small brass key that had patiently waited years to return home. None of those treasures had changed in appearance, yet each carried a new meaning. Harold approached them with a warm smile that seemed lighter than it had at the beginning of the evening. "I will meet you at the bank tomorrow morning," he said softly. Daniel trusted that the right day would eventually arrive. "I believe today proved that he was right." Emily nodded gratefully. "He always believed people were worth waiting for." Harold gently placed one hand over his heart. "He taught me that." William walked toward them after thanking the final guests for attending. The confident businessman who had welcomed everyone into the ballroom hours earlier now carried a quieter expression, one shaped less by achievement than by reflection. He looked at Emily with sincere respect. "I hope you will allow me to thank you one last time," he said. Emily smiled gently. "You have already done more than enough." William shook his head. "Not for reminding me how easily success can distract us from what truly matters." He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a simple business card before pausing for a moment. Then he smiled and slipped it back into his pocket without offering it. Emily noticed the gesture with quiet curiosity. William laughed softly. "Daniel would probably tell me that friendship should never begin with a business card." Emily smiled. "That sounds exactly like him." Ethan looked up at William with innocent honesty. "Mom says the nicest people are the ones who make you feel important without talking about themselves." William knelt to Ethan's eye level. "Your mother is raising you with extraordinary wisdom." Ethan smiled proudly. "She says she learned it from Dad." Victoria slowly approached one final time. She looked at the silver frame, now protecting the family photograph, and then back at Emily. "Thank you for accepting my apology," she said sincerely. Emily answered with the same quiet grace that had carried her through the entire evening. "Every person deserves the chance to become better than yesterday." Victoria nodded thoughtfully, understanding that forgiveness had given her a lesson no embarrassment ever could. Outside the hotel, the cool evening air welcomed Emily and Ethan as they stepped beneath a sky filled with quiet stars. Harold watched from the entrance until they disappeared down the sidewalk together, Ethan happily holding his mother's hand while talking excitedly about the mysterious safety deposit box they would open the following morning. William stood beside Harold in comfortable silence. "Do you think Daniel would have been proud?" he asked quietly. Harold smiled toward the fading silhouettes of the mother and son. "He already was," he answered. "Not because life became easy for them, but because they never allowed hardship to change who they were." William looked through the hotel windows one final time at the ballroom, where the faded family photograph had rested for a brief moment beneath the lights. Expensive flowers would be removed before sunrise. Tables would be cleared. Decorations would disappear. Yet the memory of one ordinary waitress quietly protecting the people she loved would remain with everyone who had witnessed it. Somewhere inside a well-worn photograph, a husband's smile continued reminding the world that the greatest inheritance is never measured by wealth, status, or possessions, but by the kindness we leave behind in the hearts of others. Because some families are remembered not for everything they owned, but for every promise they faithfully kept.